Kwame Mensah sat in the oversized leather chair of his father's office, staring out at the Accra skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sunlight bathed the towering buildings in a golden glow, but Kwame felt no warmth. In fact, a cold, creeping unease had settled over him since the day the company became his. At just 28 years old, he was now the head of Mensah Industries, the empire his father had built from the ground up. He should have felt pride, perhaps even invincibility. Instead, there was doubt. The weight of responsibility didn't scare him. He could handle the board meetings, the tough decisions, and the pressure from investors. What gnawed at him was something far more personal: trust. Who could he really rely on in this towering corporate machine? Who among the many people working for him was truly loyal? Kwame had always been cautious, but now, with everything at stake, he was hyper-aware of how people acted around him. And the more he watched, the more he realized everyone wore a mask. He remembered his father's words from years ago: "Son, in business, trust is worth more than money, but don't be fooled. Loyalty can be bought, and it can be sold." His father had trusted certain people implicitly, and for a while Kwame did too. Jabari, the company's director, had been his father's closest ally for decades, and Ama, the ever-diligent secretary, had worked by his father's side since he started the business. Kwame grew up seeing them as family, the trusted pillars holding up the company. But now, standing where his father once stood, Kwame wasn't so sure. His father was gone, and he was left with a company full of people who smiled too much, who agreed with everything he said a little too quickly, and who always seemed to be angling for something. How many of them were just waiting for him to fail? How many of them were truly loyal to his father's legacy? The question wouldn't leave him alone. Kwame had to know the truth. Late one night, as he paced the office, the idea hit him like a flash of inspiration. If he wanted to know how people truly behaved when they thought no one important was watching, he needed to become invisible. He needed to see the company from the inside, from the bottom up. That's when he made the decision he would become a janitor. It was risky, no doubt about it. The logistics alone would be a nightmare, keeping his true identity hidden, moving through the company unnoticed, and pretending to be just another low-level worker. But Kwame was determined. He needed to get close to the ground, to the people who worked in the shadows of the company, the ones who weren't in the executive meetings or behind polished desks. The next morning, Kwame contacted a small cleaning agency that the company outsourced for building maintenance. It didn't take long to get things in motion. Within a week, he was fitted with a janitor's uniform, given a fake ID, and assigned to the night shift cleaning crew. He didn't tell anyone in the company, not even the closest people on his team. This was something he had to do alone. That first night, as he stepped into the employee entrance wearing the dark blue jumpsuit of a janitor, his heart raced. It was strange to feel so nervous in a place that was technically his, but as he pushed the mop bucket down the hallway, passing by people who didn't even glance in his direction, he realized something: he had never been more invisible. The contrast was striking. When he wore tailored suits, people hung on his every word. Now, dressed as a janitor, he was practically a ghost, and that was exactly what he needed. Over the next few days, Kwame settled into his new routine. He mopped floors, emptied trash cans, and cleaned windows, all while keeping a low profile. No one questioned him, no one even seemed to notice him. It was both liberating and unsettling. But more importantly, he listened. Conversations in the break rooms, whispered discussions between staff, even casual comments overheard in the hallways. Kwame soaked it all in. And what he heard confirmed his worst suspicions. There was tension in the company, a deep undercurrent of dissatisfaction among the lower-level employees. They spoke about management as if they were completely detached from reality, unaware of the real struggles happening in the day-to-day grind. And then there were murmurs about Jabari. A few workers mentioned his name in hushed tones, hinting at shady dealings and backdoor arrangements. At first, Kwame didn't want to believe it. Jabari had been like an uncle to him growing up, but the more he listened, the more he realized that something wasn't right. There were too many coincidences, too many whispers of money disappearing, deals falling through, and strange favors being exchanged. Kwame knew he had to dig deeper. If Jabari was truly betraying his father's legacy, it would break him. But he couldn't ignore the signs. As the days turned into weeks, Kwame's sense of urgency grew. He had to find proof, but he couldn't act too soon. He needed to be sure. And then, one night, as he cleaned the executive offices, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Kwame stood frozen in front of Jabari's desk, his hand hovering over a small stack of papers. It wasn't unusual for him to be cleaning the executive offices at this hour, but the document that caught his eye was anything but ordinary. Among the memos and financial reports lay a contract one that bore Jabari's signature and an unmistakable transaction to an offshore account. A large sum of money had been moved, and it wasn't listed anywhere in the company's records that Kwame had seen. His heart raced as he carefully set the paper back down, making sure everything looked undisturbed. This was the first real clue, the first tangible evidence that something was wrong. But he needed more. Jabari was smart, he wouldn't leave everything out in the open. Kwame would have to dig deeper, be more cautious. He continued with his cleaning duties, his mind spinning with possibilities. What else was Jabari hiding? And why hadn't his father ever seen any of this? For years, Jabari had been his father's right-hand man. Kwame had trusted him too, until now. The betrayal was beginning to feel personal. As the night dragged on, Kwame found himself cleaning the break room, where some of the night staff gathered during their downtime. He had gotten used to keeping his head down, pushing his mop across the floor while listening to the conversations around him. Most people didn't notice him, which was exactly how he wanted it. Tonight, however, he noticed a familiar voice, Zola. Zola had been a fixture on the cleaning crew long before Kwame ever set foot in the company as a janitor. She was kind, always quick to offer a smile or help someone who needed it. Even though she didn't know who he truly was, Kwame had come to appreciate her honesty. She wasn't like the others, those who pretended to care about the company's mission while looking out for themselves. "Did you hear about Jabari's new car?" one of the workers asked, leaning back in his chair as he sipped his coffee. Zola shook her head, but the others started to chime in. "Yeah, I heard it cost more than most of us make in a year," another worker laughed bitterly. Kwame kept mopping, his ears pricked for more. "Honestly, I don't know how he gets away with it. He acts like he's untouchable," Zola said quietly, her eyes flicking toward the door as if she was afraid of being overheard. Kwame glanced at her. She wasn't the type to speak out of turn, especially about people in power. But here she was, voicing concerns Kwame had been trying to piece together for weeks. He knew there was more going on with Jabari, but Zola's words only confirmed his suspicions further. "Isn't that how it always is?" someone else muttered. "The people at the top never face consequences." Kwame's stomach churned. These weren't just idle complaints, there was real resentment here, a frustration that he hadn't fully appreciated before. Zola and the others weren't just talking about their own struggles, they were pointing to a bigger problem. One that went far beyond a few mismanaged funds or a flashy new car. The conversation shifted, but Kwame couldn't shake the feeling that he was finally starting to understand the depth of the corruption within his own company. This wasn't just about Jabari or Alma, it was about an entire culture that had taken root over the years, one where those in power abused their positions while everyone else suffered in silence. Later that night, as the rest of the cleaning crew finished their shifts, Kwame lingered in the office, pretending to tidy up long after everyone had gone home. He had access to the executive floors, thanks to his janitor's credentials, and he knew exactly where he needed to go next: Jabari's office. By now, he had become familiar with the layout, but tonight felt different. The stakes were higher. He wasn't just here to gather dust, he was here to uncover the truth. The office was quiet as Kwame slipped inside, careful not to leave any trace of his presence. The same contract he had seen earlier was still on the desk, but this time, he wasn't content with just a glance. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture, making sure to capture every detail. He moved cautiously through the room, opening drawers and rifling through documents as quietly as possible. Most of what he found seemed normal meeting agendas, business memos, routine paperwork. But as he searched through Jabari's files, he came across another set of papers that made his blood run cold. Invoices. Large sums of money funneled into questionable accounts under various company names that didn't exist. It was a classic shell company scheme, and Jabari was at the center of it. Kwame's hands trembled as he took more pictures. This was it. This was the proof he needed to bring Jabari down. But as he reached for one last file, he heard the soft click of a door handle turning. Panic shot through him as he shoved the papers back into the drawer and slid behind the door, heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open, and footsteps echoed in the room. For a moment, Kwame thought his cover had been blown. But then the footsteps retreated, and the door clicked shut again. He exhaled slowly, waiting until he was sure the coast was clear before slipping out of the office. His pulse was still racing as he made his way back to the janitorial supply room, his mind buzzing with everything he had uncovered. As Kwame locked up for the night, he couldn't help but think of Zola. She had spoken the truth earlier. People like Jabari did act like they were untouchable. But not for much longer. He had the evidence now. It was only a matter of time before Jabari's empire of lies came crashing down. The next few nights were a blur of calculated moves. Kwame spent every spare moment piecing together the evidence he had gathered. The more he looked into it, the clearer it became. Jabari had been siphoning money for years, funneling it through shell companies and pocketing millions without anyone suspecting. It wasn't just a one-time slip-up, it was systematic and far more extensive than Kwame had first thought. He couldn't help but think about his father. His father had trusted Jabari with everything: his company, his money, and even his legacy. How had he missed this? How had no one seen the signs before? Kwame felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. This wasn't just about money. This was about betrayal. Jabari had taken advantage of his father's trust, and for what? Greed? Power? The thought sickened him. It wasn't enough for Kwame to simply expose Jabari. He wanted to make sure the damage couldn't be undone. But as much as the evidence weighed on him, Kwame knew he had to tread carefully. If Jabari even got a hint that something was wrong, he would cover his tracks, and Kwame would lose his chance. He needed to be sure, needed to gather every possible piece of proof before making his move. One night, as he made his rounds cleaning the executive offices, Zola found him in the break room, looking more tired than usual. Kwame noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped just slightly. She had been working late shifts too, but tonight she seemed particularly drained. "Rough night?" Kwame asked, keeping his tone casual as he wiped down the counters. Zola gave him a weary smile. "It's been a long week, but that's nothing new around here." Kwame nodded, but something in her voice made him pause. "You ever think about getting out of here? Doing something else?" Zola laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Believe me, if I could, I would. But there's not exactly a lot of opportunities out there for someone like me." Kwame frowned. "What do you mean, someone like you?" She shrugged, her gaze drifting toward the floor. "You know, no degree, no connections. It's hard to break out of this kind of life when you're stuck in it." The words hit Kwame harder than he expected. He had never really thought about it before, how different their worlds were. For him, opportunities had always been there. His family, his name, his wealth had opened doors he never had to think twice about. But for someone like Zola, who worked hard every day just to make ends meet, those doors were often locked. Kwame felt a sudden pang of guilt. Here he was, pretending to be one of them, but the truth was, he could walk away from this at any time. Zola didn't have that luxury. "You're too good for this place," Kwame said, his voice quiet but firm. "You deserve better." Zola looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, hope. Maybe, but she quickly shook her head. "Thanks, but I don't think that's in the cards for me," she said, her voice soft. Kwame wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that she could have more, that she was capable of so much. But he bit his tongue. Now wasn't the time. They worked in silence for a while longer, the quiet of the office building settling around them. Kwame couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. Zola deserved more than this, more than scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans in a company where the higher-ups barely noticed she existed. It wasn't just Zola either. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of people like her working in the company, people who were treated as disposable, while people like Jabari lived in luxury. Kwame's determination solidified. He couldn't just stop Jabari and Emma, he needed to change the culture of the entire company. His father had built Mensa Industries on integrity and trust, but somewhere along the way, those values had been lost. Kwame was going to bring them back, but first, he needed more evidence. Over the next few nights, Kwame became even more meticulous in his investigation. He searched through old records, reviewed financial statements, and tracked down hidden files in the company's database. The deeper he dug, the more disgusted he became. Jabari and Emma had not only been embezzling, but they had also manipulated contracts, cutting backdoor deals that funneled company resources into their personal ventures. Amma, in particular, had taken advantage of her position as the trusted secretary of Kwame's father. She had been the gatekeeper, controlling access to key information, which made it easy for her to cover up the shady deals. Together, Jabari and Emma had built a house of cards, one that was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Kwame knew he couldn't wait much longer. He had gathered enough evidence to confront them, and the time for subtlety was over. He needed to make a move, and soon. One night, as he was leaving the building, he saw Jabari and Emma standing in the parking garage, talking quietly by Jabari's car. Kwame ducked behind a pillar, his heart racing as he watched them. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but the look on Jabari's face told him everything he needed to know. Jabari was starting to get nervous. He was becoming paranoid, probably sensing that someone was onto him. Kwame clenched his fists. It wouldn't be long now before Jabari made a move to cover his tracks. Kwame couldn't let that happen. He needed to act fast. As he drove home that night, his mind raced with possibilities. He had the evidence, he had the leverage, and now it was time to expose Jabari and Emma for who they really were. But how? He needed to do it in a way that left no room for doubt, a way that would show everyone the kind of people they had been dealing with. Then it hit him. A meeting, a public one. He would call a meeting with all the major stakeholders, the entire board of directors, and the top executives. And in that meeting, he would reveal everything. But there was one last thing he needed to prepare before the final showdown. Kwame smiled to himself as he pulled into his driveway. The pieces were finally falling into place. It wouldn't be long now before Jabari and Emma's empire came crashing down. As Kwame pushed forward with his plans to expose Jabari and Emma, his interactions with Zola became more frequent and meaningful. She had no idea of the story brewing behind the scenes, and that was part of the reason Kwame found himself drawn to her. Zola didn't wear a mask. She didn't pretend to be something she wasn't. There was an authenticity to her that Kwame rarely encountered, and that made her stand out even more in a company full of people who only cared about climbing the corporate ladder. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Zola invited him to join her and a few others for coffee at a small diner just down the street from the office. Kwame hesitated for a moment. It had been weeks since he'd done anything remotely social, and his mind was constantly racing with thoughts about the coming showdown with Jabari. But something about Zola's invitation made him want to step out of his usual headspace, even if only for a little while. Sure, he said, trying to sound casual. The diner was small and quiet, with booths lined along the windows and a jukebox in the corner playing old songs. It wasn't the kind of place Kwame would typically find himself, but it felt comfortable. And more importantly, it was the perfect backdrop for him to get to know Zola better. They slid into a booth, and Zola introduced him to the others. A couple of their colleagues from the cleaning crew had joined them, laughing and chatting as though the pressures of work didn't weigh on them as heavily in this space. Kwame found himself loosening up as they exchanged stories about their shifts and shared small, harmless complaints about the job. It was strange, being part of this world and yet not really belonging to it. But for now, he pushed those thoughts aside and just enjoyed the moment. At some point during the night, Zola leaned over, her voice softer than usual. "You've been quiet. Everything okay?" Kwame smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just thinking about a lot of stuff. Work mostly." She nodded, her expression understanding. "I get it. This place can wear you down. But hey, you're doing your best. We all are." Her words, simple as they were, hit Kwame in a way he hadn't expected. For the past few weeks, he had been so focused on his mission, on righting the wrongs that had taken root in the company, that he hadn't really stopped to think about the people affected by it all. Zola was doing her best. So were the others. They were working hard, trying to get by, and yet they were the ones suffering the most from the corruption above them. Zola, he started, his voice more serious now. Have you ever thought about leaving? About doing something else? She gave him a small, sad smile. I think about it all the time. But life isn't that simple. I've got bills to pay, responsibilities. It's not like I can just walk away and start fresh. Not without a lot of things lining up perfectly. Kwame's chest tightened. She was right, of course. The weight of responsibilities and the lack of opportunities kept people like Zola trapped in cycles they couldn't easily escape. It was a reality he had never truly considered, given his privileged upbringing. He could walk away from this disguise, from the corporate life, whenever he wanted. But for Zola and so many others like her, that wasn't an option. That's not fair, Kwame said softly, almost to himself. No, it's not, Zola agreed, her voice equally quiet. They talked for a while longer, and for the first time, Kwame allowed himself to open up just a bit more. He didn't reveal who he truly was, he wasn't ready for that yet, but he shared some of his frustrations with the company, with the way things were run, and how the people in power seemed to care so little about those at the bottom. Zola listened patiently, nodding in agreement. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice or judgment. She just listened, and Kwame found comfort in that. It was a rare thing, to be heard without expectation or pretense. By the time they left the diner, the night had grown cold, and the streets were mostly empty. Zola pulled her jacket tighter around herself, shivering slightly as they walked back toward the office building where they had parked. You know, Zola said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. You're different from the other guys who come through here. Kwame raised an eyebrow. Different how? She glanced at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I don't know, you just seem to care more. Like you actually see what's happening around you. Most people just go through the motions, you know? They don't really notice the things that matter. Kwame felt his heart skip a beat. Zola had no idea how close she was to the truth, how much he was seeing and planning to change. But her words only reinforced what he already knew. This company, the one his father had built, had lost its way. It was time to restore the values it had once stood for, the values that people like Zola embodied. They reached the parking lot, and for a moment they stood in the cool night air, neither of them quite ready to say goodbye. Kwame glanced at Zola, studying her face in the dim streetlight. She was tired, but there was a resilience to her that he admired. Thanks for tonight, Kwame said. I didn't realize how much I needed a break. Zola chuckled softly. Yeah, sometimes stepping away from it all helps you see things clearer. Kwame nodded, though he knew that what he was about to do would be anything but stepping away. He was heading straight into the heart of the storm. But he appreciated Zola's presence, her unspoken support. He knew that, in her own way, she had already started to change his perspective on the company, on life. As Zola got into her car and waved goodbye, Kwame watched her drive away, a sense of calm washing over him. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next day, Kwame's mind was sharper than ever. His interactions with Zola had strengthened his resolve. The more time he spent around her and the other employees, the more he realized how deeply the company's corruption had taken root. It wasn't just about Jabari and Ayama skimming money, it was about the way the company treated people like Zola. There was a culture of exploitation, and Kwame was determined to change that. But first, he needed to bring down the people responsible for the rot at the top. Kwame returned to the office that evening, dressed again in his janitor's uniform. This time, however, his goal wasn't just to blend in, he was focused. Tonight, he was going to get the final piece of evidence he needed to take Jabari and Ayama down. He began his usual routine, emptying trash cans and wiping down desks, making his way through the executive offices like any other night. But his attention was on Jabari's office. He knew Jabari kept important documents locked away in his private filing cabinet. The key, Kwame had learned, was hidden in a drawer beneath Jabari's desk, along with a digital security pass for accessing sensitive files on the company's server. Kwame had to time everything perfectly. The office was quiet, with most of the upper management having already gone home. He checked his watch just after 8 p.m. It was now or never. He made his way to Jabari's office, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. With steady hands, he slipped inside and shut the door softly behind him. The room was dark, but he didn't need light. He had memorized the layout. Kwame quickly knelt by Jabari's desk and pulled open the drawer. Sure enough, the small key was there, along with the digital security pass. His heart raced as he grabbed both, standing up and heading straight for the filing cabinet on the far wall. The cabinet opened with a soft click, revealing rows of folders neatly labeled with dates and project names. Kwame flipped through them quickly, his fingers brushing against documents that detailed various financial dealings. Then he found the folder marked Confidential. Inside, there were detailed records of transactions, names of shell companies, and offshore accounts. Everything was laid out clearly, with Jabari's signature appearing multiple times. Kwame took out his phone and began snapping pictures of each document, making sure to capture every incriminating detail. As he worked, his mind raced. This was the proof he needed. Jabari's entire scheme was spelled out in these papers. There was no way he could talk his way out of this once Kwame revealed it to the board. But as he reached the last few pages, something caught his eye: a name. Ama's, listed as a co-signer on several of the documents. Kwame had suspected her involvement, but seeing her name so blatantly tied to the embezzlement was still a shock. His father had trusted her with everything, and she had betrayed him just as deeply as Jabari had. With a deep breath, Kwame finished photographing the last page and carefully placed the documents back in the folder. He returned the key and digital pass to the desk drawer, making sure everything was exactly as he had found it. No one could know he had been here. As he stepped out of Jabari's office and locked the door behind him, Kwame felt a strange mix of relief and anger. He had the evidence. The plan was coming together. But the betrayal still stung, both for his father and for the people like Zola who were stuck in the middle of all this. Kwame couldn't shake the image of Zola from his mind as he walked back through the empty office. She had opened his eyes to the injustices happening right under his nose, and now he was ready to take action. But before he could leave the building, something unexpected happened. As Kwame passed by the break room, he heard the sound of voices, two of them, low and hushed, but unmistakable. He paused, straining to listen. One of the voices belonged to Jabari. The other was Ama. Kwame's pulse quickened. He crept closer, staying in the shadows just out of sight. "You're sure no one suspects?" Ama's voice was sharp, tinged with anxiety. "Relax," Jabari replied, though his tone was tense. "Everything's under control. By the time anyone catches on, it'll be too late. The money's already moved." Kwame's blood ran cold. They were talking about the embezzlement, confirming everything he had suspected. He leaned in closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "What about Kwame?" Ama asked, her voice dropping even lower. "He's been quiet lately." "Too quiet." Kwame held his breath. If they suspected him, everything could fall apart. "Don't worry about Kwame," Jabari said with a dismissive chuckle. "He's a kid. He has no idea what's going on. Besides, I've kept him out of the real business for years. He's not a threat." Kwame clenched his fists, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. They thought he was a fool, blind to their schemes. But they had no idea how close he was to blowing their entire operation wide open. "I still don't like it," Ama muttered. "We need to cover our tracks." "If anything goes wrong, nothing's going to go wrong," Jabari interrupted, his voice firm. "Just stick to the plan. We'll be fine." Kwame had heard enough. He backed away quietly, his mind racing. They had no idea what was coming for them. He made his way out of the building, slipping into the night with the evidence safely stored on his phone. As he walked to his car, his thoughts drifted back to Zola. She didn't know it yet, but she had played a huge role in this. Her words, her kindness, they had pushed him to take action, to see the company for what it had become. But now, Kwame had the power to change things. The evidence in his possession was enough to take Jabari and Ama down for good. The only thing left to do was plan the reveal, and he knew exactly how to do it. The next few days were a whirlwind for Kwame. Between gathering the final pieces of evidence and planning the upcoming meeting, he barely had time to breathe. But through all the chaos, his thoughts kept drifting back to Zola. She had become an unexpected source of strength for him. Her presence, her kindness, and her integrity had grounded him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. It was a quiet evening when he saw her again. Kwame had finished his rounds early, hoping to catch a moment to think alone in the break room. But when he walked in, there she was, sitting at the small table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, and Kwame felt his heart skip a beat. "Hey," Zola said, her voice warm. "I wasn't expecting anyone else to be here." "Neither was I," Kwame replied with a chuckle, moving to sit across from her. "You working late?" She nodded. "As usual, you know how it is." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the quiet hum of the building around them filling the air. Kwame could feel the weight of everything he was about to do, but here, with Zola, it all felt manageable. She had no idea about his true identity, no idea about the storm that was about to hit the company, but being around her made him feel like everything would be okay. "You look tired," Zola said suddenly, breaking the silence. Kwame smiled wryly. "Yeah, it's been a long few weeks." Zola studied him for a moment, her gaze soft. "You know, you're not like the other guys who come and go through here." Kwame raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she said, shrugging. "You actually seem to care about the people here, about what's going on around you. Most people just do their job and leave. But you notice things." Kwame felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. She saw something in him that most people didn't, and it wasn't just because of his disguise. Zola saw him as he truly was, someone who cared about the people around him, even when he was hiding his true identity. "Maybe I care too much," Kwame said, his voice low. "Sometimes I feel like I want to fix everything, but I don't know if that's possible." Zola smiled gently. "You can't fix everything, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try." Her words echoed in his mind. Kwame knew he couldn't fix all the problems in the company overnight, but he could take the first step. He could start by taking down Jabari and Aima and ensuring that the people who worked hard every day, like Zola, were treated with respect and fairness. "I like that about you," Zola said after a moment. "You actually want to make things better." Kwame met her gaze, and for a moment he felt like everything else faded away: the company, the corruption, even the evidence he'd been gathering. It was just the two of them, sitting in the break room, sharing a quiet moment. "Can I ask you something?" Kwame said suddenly, his voice tentative. "Of course," Zola replied, tilting her head curiously. "If you could do anything at all, what would it be?" Kwame asked, his eyes searching hers. "Like, if you weren't working here, what would you want to do with your life?" Zola looked surprised by the question, as if no one had ever asked her that before. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful as she considered her answer. "I've always wanted to open my own cafe," she said, her voice soft. "It sounds silly, I know. But I love the idea of having a place where people can come, relax, and feel welcome. A place that's cozy and warm, where you can just be yourself." Kwame smiled, picturing it in his mind. "That doesn't sound silly at all. It sounds perfect." Zola laughed quietly, a touch of self-consciousness in her expression. "I don't know, it's just a dream. It's hard to think about stuff like that when you're just trying to make ends meet." "You should do it," Kwame said, his voice earnest. "You should follow that dream." Zola looked at him, her smile fading slightly. "It's not that easy." Kwame wanted to tell her that it could be easy, that he could help her, that money wasn't an issue for him, but he couldn't reveal who he really was not yet. So instead, he just nodded silently, promising himself that he would find a way to help her make that dream come true. They talked for a little while longer, the conversation flowing naturally between them. Kwame found himself laughing more than he had in weeks, enjoying the easy connection they shared. Zola was unlike anyone he had ever met, and with every passing moment he felt himself falling for her more. As the evening wore on, Zola glanced at her watch and sighed. "I should probably head home. Early shift tomorrow." Kwame nodded, though he didn't want the night to end. "Yeah, me too." They stood up together, and as they made their way toward the door, Kwame hesitated for a moment. He wanted to tell her something, anything that would show her how much she meant to him. But before he could speak, Zola turned to him with a smile. "You know," she said softly, "I'm glad we've gotten to know each other. "You're a good person, Kwame." He felt a lump form in his throat. She didn't even know the half of it. "I'm glad I've gotten to know you too," Kwame replied, his voice thick with emotion. Zola smiled one last time before turning and walking out the door, leaving Kwame standing there, his heart full and heavy all at once. As he watched her disappear into the night, he knew that his feelings for her were more than just a fleeting attraction. Zola had touched something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. She had given him hope, not just for himself, but for the future of the company and the people who worked there. But with that hope came a new sense of responsibility. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let any of them down. The meeting with the board was fast approaching, and soon, everything would come to light. Jabari and Emma's corruption would be exposed, and Kwame would finally be able to start rebuilding the company from the ground up. But as the night stretched on, Kwame realized that taking down Jabari and Anna wasn't just about business anymore, it was personal. The following days passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Kwame's plan was in motion, and the meeting that would reveal everything was only a week away. As the days ticked by, the tension in the office became more palpable. Kwame could sense the unease in the air, especially among the higher-ups. Jabari, in particular, seemed more on edge than usual. Kwame watched him closely, careful not to reveal any hint that he knew what was going on. He continued with his janitorial duties as if nothing had changed, but inside, his heart was racing. Today, everything would change. As the clock inched closer to the meeting time, Kwame made his way toward the large conference room on the executive floor. He had chosen this setting carefully public enough to ensure that Jabari and Emma couldn't simply sweep things under the rug, but private enough that the fallout could be contained within the company. One by one, the board members filed in, along with key executives, all taking their seats around the polished wooden table. Jabari and Emma arrived last, looking confident as ever. Jabari gave a brief nod to the room before taking his seat at the head of the table, while Emma sat by his side, as she always had. Kwame watched them from the corner of the room, unnoticed, as he carried a tray of water and coffee. He moved quietly, blending into the background, just as he had done for weeks. But today was different. Today he wasn't invisible. Today he held all the power. Once everyone was seated, Jabari cleared his throat, standing up to address the room. "Thank you all for coming," Jabari began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "I know there's been a lot of talk lately about the direction of the company, and I want to take this opportunity to clarify a few things and discuss our strategy moving forward." Kwame could barely listen to the words. He knew Jabari's speech was just more manipulation, more lies. Jabari was trying to assert his control over the room, to make everyone believe he had everything under control. But soon they would all see the truth. As Jabari continued to speak, Kwame felt a wave of calm wash over him. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He set down the tray, straightened his posture, and took a step forward. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Kwame said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. The room went silent, all eyes turned toward him. Jabari's face contorted in surprise, his brow furrowing as he looked at Kwame. For a moment there was confusion, but then recognition flashed in Jabari's eyes. "What are you doing here?" Jabari demanded, his voice sharp. Kwame stepped forward, pulling off the janitor cap and tossing it aside. His disguise was no longer needed. "I'm here to tell the truth," Kwame said, his voice steady and clear. "About you, about Emma, and about what you've been doing to this company." The room was deathly quiet. Jabari stared at him, his face pale, while Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Kwame turned toward the board members, who were watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and confusion. "I'm Kwame Mensah," he said, his voice ringing through the room. "The son of the man who built this company from the ground up, and I've been watching. I've seen how you've twisted everything my father stood for, how you've stolen from the company, and how you've betrayed the trust that was placed in you." Jabari's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked stunned, as if the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. "I have proof," Kwame continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a stack of documents. "Proof that Jabari and Emma have been embezzling funds from the company for years. They've been funneling money into offshore accounts, using shell companies to cover their tracks. Everything you need to know is right here. He tossed the papers onto the table, and the board members immediately leaned forward to examine them. Jabari took a step back, his face ashen. Amma looked like she was on the verge of panic, her eyes darting between Kwame and the papers. "This is ridiculous," Jabari finally spat out, his voice shaking. "You can't prove any of this." "I can, and I will," Kwame shot back. "I've been working undercover for weeks gathering evidence. I've seen the contracts, the transactions, everything. And you've left a trail that's impossible to cover up." The board members whispered among themselves, flipping through the documents. Their faces grew more serious with every page they turned. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone. "You thought no one would notice," Kwame continued, his voice gaining strength. "You thought you could get away with it because you were trusted. But you were wrong. My father built this company on integrity and trust, and you've destroyed that." Jabari clenched his fists, his composure crumbling. "You don't know what you're talking about." It's over," Jabari Kwame interrupted. "You've been caught." Amma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is a setup. We've done nothing wrong." Kwame turned to her, his expression hard. "You were part of it too, Amma. You helped cover it up. You signed off on the deals. You've both betrayed everything this company stands for." For a moment, the room was still. The board members were silent, their eyes moving between Kwame, Jabari, and Amma. Jabari's face was twisted in anger, but behind his eyes, Kwame saw fear. He knew it was over. Finally, one of the board members, an older man who had known Kwame's father for years, spoke up. "Is this true, Jabari?" the man asked, his voice steady but grave. "Have you been embezzling from the company?" Jabari didn't answer. His silence was enough. The board member stood, shaking his head. "We need to suspend Jabari and Amma immediately, pending an internal investigation." Jabari looked around the room, desperation in his eyes. "You can't do this. I've been running this company. You've been stealing from this company," Kwame said coldly. "And now you're going to face the consequences." Amma slumped back into her chair, defeated. The board members began to talk among themselves, discussing the next steps. The weight of what had just happened settled over the room like a heavy fog. Kwame stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. It was done. Jabari and Amma had been exposed. But as he stood there, watching the fallout unfold, he felt something unexpected, a deep sadness. His father had trusted these people, had built something beautiful, only to see it tarnished by greed. But now Kwame had the chance to make it right. The aftermath of Kwame's revelation was swift and brutal. Within minutes of the documents being reviewed, Jabari and Amma had been suspended, pending a formal investigation. Their faces, once full of smug confidence, were now pale with fear and anger. Kwame stood at the head of the conference room, watching the scene unfold. But he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. As the board members murmured among themselves, Jabari suddenly erupted. "This is a witch hunt." His voice cracked with desperation, a stark contrast to the calm, controlled persona he had maintained for years. "You're all making a huge mistake. None of this is real. You're going to ruin everything." Kwame didn't flinch. "The only thing being ruined here is the scheme you and Amma have been running behind everyone's backs. This company has a chance to recover now, but it's clear it can't happen with you involved." Jabari glared at him, his fists clenched. "You're just a kid. You have no idea how hard it is to run a business like this. Do you think your father was some saint? He made deals you couldn't even begin to understand." Kwame's stomach twisted at the insinuation, but he stood his ground. "My father trusted you. He believed in you, and you used that trust to line your own pockets. Don't try to rewrite history. You think you can just waltz in here, play the hero, and tear everything down?" Jabari spat. "You're not capable of running this company. You're not your father?" The room fell silent. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. But Kwame didn't let them sink, and he couldn't. He looked Jabari square in the eyes and took a step forward. "I'm not my father," Kwame said calmly, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I can't rebuild what you've broken. I may not have been ready before, but I am now." and I'll make sure this company stands for something again." The board members were watching closely, their expressions tense. Kwame knew this was a critical moment. He had proven Jabari's corruption, but now he had to prove that he was capable of leading the company. They needed to see strength, resolve, and vision qualities his father had always embodied. Jabari's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "You think you can clean this place up? You're naive, Kwame. The world doesn't work the way you think it does. The minute you try to change things, you'll be eaten alive by the people you're trying to protect." Kwame's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Alma stood up abruptly. Her face was flushed with panic, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. "I'm not sticking around for this," she muttered, pushing her chair back. "You can all figure this out on your own." But as Alma made a move to leave, one of the board members stood, blocking her path. "You're not going anywhere, Alma," he said, his tone firm. "We're going to deal with this properly. If you're innocent, you'll have your chance to explain." Emma's eyes darted around the room, but she could see the walls closing in. Jabari, on the other hand, wasn't giving up so easily. "You're all fools," Jabari snarled. "Do you think Mensa Industries can survive without me? I've been the backbone of this company for decades. Without me, it'll crumble." Kwame felt the anger boiling inside him. Jabari was still trying to hold on to control, even as everything slipped through his fingers. But Kwame wasn't going to let him walk away from this unscathed. "You've done enough damage," Kwame said, his voice cold. "This company has survived worse, and it will survive without you." The board members nodded in agreement. It was clear that Jabari's reign of deception was coming to an end. Kwame had exposed the truth, and now the company could begin the long process of rebuilding. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Jabari finally seemed to accept that he was out of options. He straightened his jacket, his eyes narrowing at Kwame with pure hatred. "You'll regret this," Jabari hissed, his voice low but venomous. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming." Kwame didn't respond. He just watched as Jabari turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, followed closely by Amma, who looked like she was on the verge of tears. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. For a moment, no one spoke. The board members exchanged glances, clearly shaken by the intensity of what had just happened. But Kwame didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. Drained, even. He had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the corruption, removed the toxic influences from the company, and cleared the path for a new beginning. But the weight of what came next loomed large in his mind. Running a company, especially one in crisis, wasn't going to be easy. And despite his determination, a small part of him wondered if Jabari had been right. Could he handle this? Could he live up to his father's legacy? One of the board members, the same older man who had questioned Jabari earlier, approached Kwame. "I knew your father well," he said quietly. "He was a good man, and I think he'd be proud of what you've done here today." Kwame nodded, though he wasn't sure how to respond. He wanted to believe that his father would be proud, but the road ahead seemed daunting. Still, there was no turning back now. "I appreciate that," Kwame said finally, his voice soft but sincere. "I just want to do what's right." "And you have," the board member replied. "Now it's time to rebuild." Kwame took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words. Rebuilding wasn't just about the company, it was about restoring the values that his father had held so dear: trust, integrity, fairness. And it was about ensuring that people like Zola, the hard-working employees who were often overlooked, had a voice in the company's future. As the meeting came to a close, the board began discussing the next steps. Jabari and Amma would face a formal investigation, and in the meantime, Kwame would step in as the acting CEO. It wasn't official yet, but everyone in the room knew it was only a matter of time before Kwame took full control of Mensa Industries. Once the meeting adjourned, Kwame lingered in the conference room for a moment, taking in the gravity of what had just happened. He had won this battle, but the war to restore the company's soul was only just beginning. Before leaving the room, he glanced at the empty chairs where Jabari and Amma had sat. They were gone, and soon they would be nothing but a bad memory. But their actions had left scars, and it would take time to heal them. Kwame squared his shoulders and walked out of the room, ready to face whatever came next. After the meeting, Kwame felt an overwhelming mix of relief and exhaustion. Jabari and Ayama were out, and the company's future was now in his hands. But as the dust settled, his thoughts drifted away from the chaos of the boardroom to something, or rather, someone much more important: Zola. Zola had no idea how much she had helped him throughout this journey. Her kindness, her strength, and her ability to see the good in people had been a light in what had often felt like a very dark time. Kwame hadn't told her the truth about who he really was, but that was about to change. He knew he couldn't move forward without her by his side, and more importantly, he didn't want to. The next day, Kwame made his way to the office, but this time it wasn't for any board meetings or company business. He was there for Zola. He found her, as usual, working diligently on one of the upper floors, wiping down the windows of a large corner office. She didn't notice him at first, and for a brief moment Kwame just watched her, marveling at how one person could change everything. Finally, he cleared his throat, and she turned around, smiling when she saw him. "Hey, what are you doing up here?" she asked, wiping her hands on a cloth. Kwame hesitated for a second, then took a deep breath. "There's something I need to talk to you about." Zola frowned slightly, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," Kwame nodded. "It's just... there's a lot you don't know about me, about who I really am." Zola's expression softened with concern. "What do you mean?" Kwame stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had to tell her everything. He had been hiding behind a disguise for weeks, and now it was time to come clean. "I'm not just a janitor," Kwame began, his voice steady but quiet. "I've been working undercover here. But not for the reasons you might think. My name is Kwame Mensah. I'm the owner of Mensah Industries." Zola blinked, the words clearly not registering at first. "Wait, what?" Kwame exhaled, taking her hands gently in his. "My father built this company, and after he passed, I inherited it. I came here as a janitor to see the company from the inside, to understand what was really happening. And what I found was that the people at the top were corrupt, stealing from the company, abusing their power. I've been working to fix that." Zola stared at him, her mouth slightly open, trying to process the information. "You're Kwame Mensah?" "As in?" "The Kwame Mensah? The one who owns all of this?" Kwame smiled sheepishly. "Yeah, that's me." For a moment, Zola didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her eyes wide with shock. Then, slowly, she started to laugh, a soft, disbelieving sound that grew louder as the reality of the situation sank in. "I can't believe this," she said, shaking her head. "All this time you've been... you? I thought you were just a janitor." Kwame finished for her, his smile widening. "Yeah, exactly." Zola nodded, still laughing. "Yeah, exactly." Kwame chuckled along with her, but then his expression grew serious again. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I couldn't risk anyone finding out. I needed to see the company for what it really was, without anyone treating me differently." Zola's laughter faded and she met his gaze, her eyes softening. "I get it. I mean, it's a lot to take in, but I understand why you did it." Kwame felt a rush of relief wash over him. He had been worried that Zola would be upset or feel betrayed, but her acceptance of the truth only made him love her more. "There's something else I need to say," Kwame continued, taking another deep breath. "These past few weeks, you've been one of the only things that kept me going. Your kindness, your honesty, you've shown me what really matters. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." Zola's eyes widened slightly, and Kwame could see the surprise in her expression. But before she could respond, he dropped to one knee, pulling a small ring box from his pocket. "Zola." "No," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I've spent so much of my life focused on this company, on trying to live up to my father's expectations. But meeting you, you've shown me that there's more to life than just business. I don't want to run this company alone, I want to build something with you. Both here and in life." He opened the box, revealing a beautiful, simple diamond ring. Zola gasped softly, her hands covering her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. "Will you marry me?" Kwame asked, his heart in his throat. For a moment, there was only silence. Zola stared at the ring, then at Kwame, her face a mix of shock and overwhelming emotion. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, of course I will." Kwame's heart soared. He stood, slipping the ring onto her finger as Zola wiped tears from her cheeks. Then, without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as they both laughed and cried at the same time. "I can't believe this is happening," Zola said, her voice thick with emotion. "This feels like a dream." "It's real," Kwame whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And it's just the beginning." They stood there for a moment, holding each other, wrapped in the warmth of their love and the excitement of their future together. Kwame had faced so many challenges in the past few weeks, but none of it mattered now. He had found something far more valuable than power or money. He had found Zola. As they finally pulled apart, Kwame took her hand and smiled. "There's a lot to do, but we'll figure it out. Together." Zola nodded, her eyes shining. "I know we will." Hand in hand, they walked out of the office, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would rebuild the company. But more importantly, they would build a life filled with love, trust, and the kind of honesty that had brought them together in the first place. The news of Kwame Mensah's proposal to Zola spread through the company like wildfire. It wasn't long before every employee knew the story of how their new CEO had gone undercover as a janitor, exposed corruption at the highest levels, and then proposed to the woman who had captured his heart along the way. The tale became a symbol of change and hope, both for the company and for the people who worked there. But for Kwame and Zola, life had quickly shifted from corporate intrigue to planning for the future, both personal and professional. Kwame had officially taken the reins as CEO of Mensah Industries, and with Zola by his side, they set about restoring the company to its former glory, built on the values his father had instilled: integrity, fairness, and compassion. Their first day back at the office together as an engaged couple felt surreal. The tension of the past few weeks had finally lifted, and there was a sense of optimism in the air. As they walked through the office, hand in hand, employees greeted them with smiles and congratulations. For the first time in a long while, Kwame felt like things were truly headed in the right direction. Zola looked up at him as they made their way to the executive floor. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Kwame smiled down at her. "With you by my side?" "Absolutely." They stepped into the elevator, and as the doors closed, Kwame felt a wave of calm settle over him. He had been through so much, had faced so many doubts and fears, but now, with Zola's hand in his, he knew they could handle whatever came next. Once they reached the top floor, Kwame led Zola into his office. It was the same office his father had occupied for decades, a space filled with memories of the man who had built the company from the ground up. But now it was Kwame's turn to take the helm, and with Zola's influence, the company was about to enter a new era. Kwame had spent the past few days restructuring the company's leadership team, bringing in people who shared his vision of fairness and accountability. He had also set up a new set of policies aimed at ensuring transparency and respect for all employees, from the executives to the cleaning staff. Zola, who had always been modest about her role in the company, was now working with Kwame to develop programs that supported the lower-level employees, the people who often went unnoticed but were essential to the company's success. She had ideas about offering more education and career development opportunities for workers who wanted to move up, and Kwame was fully on board. "I've been thinking," Zola said as they sat down together in the office, "about starting an employee wellness program. You know, something that offers more than just the usual benefits. Something that really invests in the people who work here." Kwame nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I love that idea. What do you have in mind?" Zola's face lit up as she started to explain her vision. She talked about mental health support, flexible working hours, and creating a sense of community within the company, a place where people felt valued, no matter their position. Kwame listened intently, his admiration for her growing with every word. Zola had a way of seeing people, of understanding what they needed to thrive, and Kwame knew her ideas would change the company for the better. I want this to be a place where people feel like they belong, Zola finished, her eyes shining with passion. Where they feel respected no matter what job they do. Kwame reached across the desk, taking her hand in his. That's exactly what this company needs. You're going to make a huge difference, Zola. She smiled softly, squeezing his hand. We'll do it together. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Kwame and Zola worked side by side, implementing the changes they had envisioned. They met with employees from every department, listening to their concerns and ideas. Slowly but surely, the culture of the company began to shift. The toxic environment that Jabari and Aima had created was being replaced by one of openness and respect. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Kwame wondered if they were moving too fast, if they were trying to change too much too soon. But every time he felt doubt creeping in, Zola was there to remind him why they were doing this. Together, they were creating something new, something better. One afternoon, as they were walking through the building, Kwame noticed a group of employees gathered in the break room, chatting and laughing. It was a small moment, but it struck him as significant. There was a light in the air that hadn't been there before, a sense of camaraderie that reminded him of why he had taken on this challenge in the first place. Look at them, Zola said quietly, nodding toward the group. This is what it's all about. Kwame smiled. Yeah, it is. Later that day, Kwame received a call from the board of directors. They had concluded their investigation into Jabari and Aima's actions, and the verdict was clear: both had been found guilty of embezzling funds and legal action was being taken. It was the final chapter in a dark period of the company's history, and Kwame felt a sense of closure as the board outlined the next steps. When he hung up the phone, he looked over at Zola, who was sitting at her desk, working on her latest employee program. She glanced up at him, sensing the shift in his mood. Good news? She asked. Kwame nodded. It's over. Jabari and Aima are officially out. Legal's handling the rest. Zola smiled softly, standing and walking over to him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head on his chest. You did it, she whispered. You saved the company. We did it, Kwame corrected, holding her close. I couldn't have done any of this without you. They stood there for a moment, wrapped in each other's arms, feeling the weight of the past few months lift off their shoulders. They had been through so much, but now they were ready to move forward together. As they pulled apart, Kwame looked down at Zola, his heart full. Are you ready for the next chapter? Zola smiled up at him, her eyes bright with love and excitement. I've never been more ready. And with that, they stepped into their future, hand in hand, ready to build a life and a legacy that would be remembered for generations to come.